We're live.
All right.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bridges Conversations. My name is Steve Givens. I'm the Executive Director of the Bridges Foundation in St. Louis. We are an almost 40-year-old organization that delivers the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola in everyday life. And we do these little monthly conversations with our friends, with Ignatian authors, with people involved in Bridges. And today we are meeting once again with my friend Eric Clayton, who will tell you a little bit about himself in a bit, but he is I'm at this point, I'm going to go with renowned, if not, or maybe best-selling author of a number of Ignatian spirituality books, including his most recent one, which we'll be talking about mainly today, called Finding Peace Here and Now, How Ignatian Spirituality Leads Us to Healing and Wholeness. Eric will also be in town here in St. Louis in July for Bridges Ignatian Community Retreat, which will be held July 17th and 18th, I think is right, if that's a Friday and a Saturday, at the Pallottine Retreat Center up in North County. So, Eric, welcome to the show again.
Thanks, Steve. Always good to be with you. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, let's start, as we always do, with just tell our people who are listening a little bit about yourself, your family of origin, your kind of early story of faith. So, how did you get to be who you are today, kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I grew up, I'm from California originally, but I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I have one brother and then my two parents. And as far as faith goes, I was a cradle Catholic. Grew up going to Catholic elementary school, Catholic high school, Jesuit, Catholic college, Fairfield University. But what was really important for my faith journey was my mom worked for our parish for many kind of very formative years of my my younger years, and so I always had kind of a behind the scenes look at the faith life, at parish life, at different kind of vocational paths, and that was just very formative for me because I knew a lot of seminarians, I knew a lot of priests, I knew a lot of people that were kind of coming through those parish doors, had a lot of friends there. And it also ended up being, for kind of a nerdy kid, it ended up being a really important social place as well. A lot of my kind of social groups ended up revolving around the church. And so, kind of that early Catholic imagination was formed. Again, we went to mass every Sunday, I had religion class at school, but I, so much of my life was in the parish. And I think that was really key, really formative. And as I kind of grew and, wrestled with all the same kind of questions I think so many of us do. Religion and faith was more than, here are, a set of commandments. It was really community and lived experience. And I think that was really important when I got to college and, began to meet a lot of Jesuits and people of different faiths and no faith at all. And kind of began these really important conversations. And now I live outside of Baltimore, Maryland with my wife and my 2 daughters. Steve, you and I were talking. We just celebrated my daughter's first communion this past weekend. So it's a real kind of full circle experience of faith formation.
Yeah, awesome. Was it at Fairfield when you really kind of came in contact with Ignatian spirituality for the first time? And what's your own experience of the spiritual exercises? Have you done them in either a 30-day or a 19th annotation form or?
Yeah. So Fairfield was my first experience of the Jesuits. I didn't really go to Fairfield wanting a Jesuit school. I didn't really know what that meant. I knew Fairfield was Catholic, but I wasn't even necessarily looking for a Catholic school. Fairfield was the school I wanted. And, how serendipitous, right? And I got involved in campus ministry very early on, and then was involved in campus ministry the whole way through. Did a lot of service immersion trips. It formed my studies and kind of ultimately led to my work at Catholic Relief Services in many ways. But to answer your question, yes, my first experience of the Jesuits, I remember freshman year, they were doing some sort of a new program. It was a 19th annotation, but kind of crammed into a semester. And so we did that, and it was really good. It was really helpful. I took it very seriously. But I wouldn't say. It was foundational in a lot of ways, right? But I remember my sophomore year, I got connected with the Jesuit who was my spiritual director basically until he died a few years ago, the great Father Jim Bowler. And so he would direct me, but we didn't do the exercises in kind of their 19th annotation full form until, I don't know, a couple years ago, maybe a year or two before he died. And it was funny because he said to me, Eric, I know you think you did the exercises, but you didn't. And so now we got to do them for real now. And I remember feeling a little taken aback by that and being like, oh my gosh, my whole foundation has been a lie, but not at all. It was just such a wonderful deepening experience and a real, I think, kind of firsthand account of how the exercises fit. You kind of mold into where we are in our lives, in our formation. Freshman year, I was ready for a certain kind of experience of Ignatian spirituality. But, as a early 30-something-year-old, I needed something more serious. And I think Jim knew that. And so Fairfield was formative to my Ignatian identity. And saying that, yes, Ignatian spirituality is how I understand the world. But then I went and I worked at Catholic Relief Services for many years. And I think I realized then, like, I'm writing from this kind of tradition of Ignatian spirituality and a lot of Catholic social teaching. I felt like I knew so much. And then I started working at the Jesuit Conference in Communications and very quickly realized how little I knew. You go, oh, okay, I know the buzzwords, I know the Latin, but I don't know the depth. You have that kind of tip of the iceberg. And so I was very lucky. I got to do a certificate program at Creighton University with Eileen Burke Sullivan, who's just renowned theologian who also recently passed away. But kind of got some of the history and the theology and an opportunity to do a pilgrimage. And so, it's always expanding. But it's funny to think, at Fairfield, I was so deep in Ignatian spirituality, and then to think, wow, every day I learned so much more, and there's always more to go, right? That's the spiritual life.
Yeah. Thank you for all that. It helps us kind of understand who you are and where you come from. We talked before, I don't know, sometime last year about a couple of your books. I think the Cannonball Moments and the Star Wars book. But yeah, hold on. You got those both up? There you go.
Star Wars, yeah.
So, My Life with the Jedi.
Star Wars.
And we're coming up on May 4th and just, next week. So
Steve, I know your calendar, you circle it, so you don't miss it. It's an important holiday. But me and my kids are excited to go build some Legos at the Lego store. They always give out free Star Wars Legos. So very excited for that. But Cannonball Moments is here too, but it's under the pile of books. So I don't know if I can pull it up as quickly.
And Cannonball Moments is a book about storytelling and creativity and Ignatian spirituality. And we actually had a Magis group this year in our Bridges program which was a writers group that I led, and we used your book as our guide for the year, and that was a really great experience.
Awesome.
But today we want to talk about not your most recent book. We'll return to that in a minute, but your book from this past year called Finding Peace Here and Now. Why don't you give us the subtitle of that book and tell us a little bit about how that idea arose and kind of what's the gist of that book? Because it's also kind of going to be the theme for our retreat in July.
Yeah, so Finding Peace Here and Now, How Ignatian Spirituality Leads Us to Healing and Wholeness from Brazos Press. This book, in many ways was a long time coming. I've always been very interested in peace and peace spirituality. When I was at Fairfield, I studied international studies, and peace spirituality was definitely a key part of how I approached a lot of my projects and writing. And then I was at American University for my master's degree. Again, kind of what does peace have to say for the way we tell stories? So I've always been really interested in peace. And even when I worked at Catholic Relief Services, I would look at these really impressive professional peace builders and think, oh man, I want to do this. It was a really important moment in my own kind of prayer life when I realized, these people are doing great work, but I might not be called to be a professional peace builder, right? That might not be what's going to pay my bills, but we are all called to this work of peace. And how do we incorporate that into our lives, into our spiritual lives, into our daily lives? What does that look like? So that's always been in my mind and important to me, and something I wrestle with, right? Not an expert, but kind of someone else along the journey. And so, Ignatian, as I said, Ignatian spirituality is just key to how I understand the world and understand God at work in the world. So Ignatian spirituality and peace going together was important for me in my thinking. The book is really meant to be a companion, either a companion for someone who's going through the exercises. It's formatted in the same way the exercises are. As part of that certificate program at Clayton, we read so many really good books that you would say, here's the chapter on the 2 standards. Here's the chapter on, the 3rd week. And you would be able to really enfold that into your experience of the exercises. So in some ways I was thinking, well, that's what I want this book to be. I want this book to add that perspective of peace. How do we think about peace when we're traveling through the exercises? The other thing is it's a great introduction to Ignatian spirituality. This book was written with that audience in mind, like, hey, maybe folks don't know the Ignatian tradition, but boy, oh boy, peace is something we need in our days. So maybe you're thinking about peace and wondering how you can make it your own. Ignatian spirituality can give us some of those tools. And so that's really where it starts, is this idea of we all want peace. We don't quite know where to go to get it. We look out at the world, the headlines and bombs dropping here and guns firing there. And we just say, I don't know what to do. But Ignatian spirituality, Ignatius tells us to, God, the Spirit is already at work within us. How do we respond to that? And so that's really the starting point of the book, is looking within and claiming, okay, if we can figure out who God is asking us to be, then our chance of being peace in the world is much greater. And Ignatius gives us some really compelling, meditations to help us to get there.
Yeah, I often, when talking to people about the spiritual exercises or leading people through them, the question sometimes arises is, what are these exercises for? What am I going to get out of it? And the answer that I've grown really comfortable with lately, it seems like, is that the exercises give us a way through, and they give us a way of proceeding. Is that hold true, you think, for what you're talking about in this book?
I think a lot about the Ignatian spirituality as a trajectory setting spirituality, right? And it helps us to constantly be course correcting. I love the 2 standards as a meditation, as that challenge to say, okay, well, is this decision, big or small, going to move me closer to Christ's standard or towards the standard of the enemy? Am I going towards, poverty, rejection, humility, or riches, honors, and pride? And so the book really, gives, peace is kind of what is at the heart of all of that. And I think about peace, obviously people not killing each other is a great start for peace. But I think it's also this sense of, are we grasping for things that perhaps aren't ours to do? God has given us unique vocations. God has given us, unique desires and skills and dreams. And I know I waste a lot of my time worrying about the things that I'm not doing, worrying about the success other people are having. And I know that what that does for me is it gives a huge amount of a lack of peace. So if I can center myself in, well, who is God asking me to become? As you said, kind of move through, whatever we are in our lives, dark moments, high moments, relationships, all these things, right? Am I focused on what God has given me to do and developing and growing in that? Or am I grasping? Because I think that idea of grasping for what is someone else's to do, I think is a pretty easy kind of microcosm to kind of zoom out, to scale up, and to see that as in many ways a root of so many problems in our world, so many conflicts, hot and cold. People are grasping for what isn't theirs, and taking from other people, or trying to, project, pride. So I'm better than you, and here's because I have all this stuff. If we really spent that time reflecting on who we are made to be, which is the root of Ignatian spirituality, right? Those questions of vocation. I think peace is a fruit that then comes from that prayer.
Yeah. I think I was listening to you on the your AMDG podcast just yesterday, and you were quoting one of my favorite people, Joe Tetlow, of saying, what's those 3 questions? Look at me with all this stuff. Look at all my stuff. Look at me with all this stuff. Look at me.
Yeah.
Right. So let's. I think that's a good segue to the next thing I want to talk about, which is this idea of, and you already started, but let's go a little deeper. This idea of the magis in the spiritual exercises is always this idea of, we all know magis means more, but it really means something bigger than that, and it means, finding the more that God wants us to have, and to find, again, quoting Joe Tetlow, the next right thing or the next great thing that we're supposed to be doing. Talk a little bit about the role of magis in this kind of spirituality of peace, and maybe the creative tension between pursuing more and pursuing magis, and what that has to do with resting in the present and in the presence,
Yeah.
So a lot of questions in there, but you can take that wherever you want.
I'm stuck on the next right thing. I don't think I knew Joe Tetlow said that, but I did know that
he could be quoting somebody else.
Well, it's in Frozen. It's Frozen 2. It's one of the songs in Frozen 2, which I'm sure is what Father Tetlow was referring.
I'm going to maybe see him tomorrow, and I'm going to tell him that you accused him of quoting Frozen. So
yeah, no, you can tell him that. That's fine. I actually just on a podcast with a Jesuit in formation, and I kept saying the next right thing. He's like, that's from Frozen 2. I said, yeah, I know. I have two kids. I'm well versed.
Of course, yeah, that's right.
The magis is such an easy word to put on a billboard or a flag on a campus, and I think I've seen it so much, right? We want the magis, and it's easy to reduce that to more internships, more push-ups, more championships, more money, more enrollment, right?
Not that the Jesuits are ever concerned about those things, no. So
you said it, man. You said it. Yeah, no. I mean, it's because in some ways it's easy, right? It's like, this is a Jesuit word, and we're gonna put it on a thing, and it's mission identity. But in fact, right, it doesn't just mean more. Ignatius was very clear, right, when he talks about the greater glory of God and the good of all souls, right? That's supposed to be a guiding star to help us really decide, how is the stuff I'm doing uniquely better serving God's greater glory, right? Like that, we're turning the volume up on God here, and so it's not just acquiring stuff, but it's a unique vein that we're trying to tap into. Like this here is the singular way that God is going to increase in this moment. I mean, I think about Ignatius's story, right? Ignatius's story, he wants to do great things for God, right? And so he goes to the Holy Land, and then he goes to the, and then he wants to he's going to found this great order, and he wants to travel, and he's all these great dreams. And where does he end up? He's an administrator. He ends up behind a desk, sending emails all day, basically, right? But he knew that was what God wanted for him. He deserved it. I have to imagine, it wasn't necessarily a younger Ignatius would probably be disappointed. But that was the unique magis that God wanted from Ignatius. That was whereas Francis Xavier, right, was sent all over the world. And so that's for me as I reflect on my life. You look at so many people that are doing great and wonderful things. Writers that are doing great and wonderful things. And I have to always remember, all right, Eric, are you grasping for what they have been uniquely sent to do, for the good that they're contributing in the world? Are you envious of these other things, or are you trying to sink into what has been given to you? What are my unique desires and dreams and skills and experiences and relationships and ways of being in the world that are going to bring about that good thing that God is trying to do in my life, in and through my life? And I think it's hard. I think it's very hard, because we are always inundated with a lot of bad and a lot of good. And I feel like we're just bouncing back and forth between everything is terrible and I'm not good enough because I'm not doing this other good thing that someone is doing. It takes a real discipline that I'm not pretending to have, at least not fully, to sink in to say, well, what is God asking of me? It necessarily will look different from what other people are doing, but that's right to sink into. And I think that once we make peace with that, peace grows then from where we have kind of staked our flag, right? And that's what I'm thinking about with magic. So I could, simply wanting more. There's a million more things I could want. Good things, right? Good things. I can give more money, and I can give more volunteer time, and I can, do X, Y, and Z, and I can run myself absolutely ragged. But is that the good that God is asking me to do? Or is that the good that God was asking 28 other people to do, and now I've run ripshot over it, instead of allowing those people to do the good God is trying to do through them?
Yeah. I'm always reminded of, no doubt you know him, but Protestant theologian Frederick Buechner, whose probably most famous quote is about our great desire meeting the world's great need. So not only what do we want to do, but where is that going to meet someone's need?
Yeah, that was emblazoned on a stone outside of one of our residence halls at Fairfield when I was there. So I know that well.
That's right. We have a few people watching, I see, and if you guys have any questions for Eric, just put them in the chat there on Facebook, and I will see them, and we'll return to them when we can. I think both in this book, and obviously for me anyway, in the Cannonball Moments book, there's a lot of conversation, a lot of stress on the importance of storytelling, of knowing and telling our own story, or at least being aware of it. Where does this come into play in this book, and how does storytelling and knowing our own history come into the work of peacemaking?
Well, I think it's crucial, right, to know where we're coming from, and to know, what context we're the product of, to be able to kind of bring our full selves into the work of peace. I mean, to what I was just saying, right, the idea of being able to sink into who God has made us to be is not possible if we don't look at the full scope of who we are. I always go back to John English, great Canadian Jesuit, who talks about graced history, and he says God is approving and affirming when we look at our graced history, right? When we pray with our graced history, even those places that we are hard, right? The place where we messed up. Not to say that God is not saying, stick with the status quo. You've done it perfect. Just leave it alone. But God is saying, yes, it is good for you to go back and to reflect on where you've been, how God is at work in the patterns in your life. Because I think that is how we discover who God is making us to be in the present. and inviting us to become. And of course, we know. I mean, then zoom out, right? The story of an individual, the story of a community, the story of a nation, the story of the world, right? Without knowing the stories, the narratives, right? People get left out, right? We can see that right now in real time, right? Who are the people whose stories are not being told? Or people whose stories are being told for them, or people whose stories we just pretend never happened. Those are not, ignoring story, ignoring narrative is not a way to build lasting peace or to do justice, right? Which is ultimately kind of a key element of God's project is peace and justice. Peace requires justice be done. Otherwise, it's not lasting. It's not structural. It's just peace is not people not punching each other, right? Peace is full flourishing relationships. I can easily put I can put one girl with my two kids. I can put one in one room and one in the other room and close the door and we'll have peace. But but of course we all know, right? You laugh because that's silly. That's not peace. That's separation. What we want is relationship. If they're having a tough day, they need to come together and work it out. So that the whole family can thrive and flourish. Not simply be locked in different rooms. So it's a silly small example, but scale that up and you can see how peace demands the full collision of different stories and different perspectives and different understandings of the world, but interwoven and understood so that the humanity can flourish.
Yeah. I think what we're talking about, and this is something you and I talked earlier, is in the midst of all this work of peace, what we're really looking at here is the possibility of transformation, right? We're looking at our own cannonball moments, our own stories, the stories of others. There can be this inclination to throw up our hands and say, this is the way it's always been. We can't change anything. But the work of peace must include the belief in the possibility of transformation, the idea of what might my life be yet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts kind of out of the gate on this one. One, I think it's such an important question, right? For all of us. I did a lot of work with the Ignatian Volunteer Corps for a year. They were using my book, Cannonball Moments. And those are a lot of folks that are retired, right? And so it's tempting, because some of them would say this, it's tempting to say, oh, well, I'm at the end of my story or my vocation. I'm kind of just running the tracks, to the end of the line here. But that's not true, right? The story is always unfolding, right? This is, again, key. Why is story important? Because our story is always still unfolding. And there's always room for something new. I love to talk about, God as the God of surprises, right? Things can shake us out of our complacency. And then, we were talking, Steve, I know I said we were going to talk about this book, but another book I'm working on now, right, is this book on myth and story structure and how God is at work in kind of some of these fantastical tropes, fantasy and fairy tale. But key to those kinds of stories is shaking us out of a status quo. Think of any story, right? Most stories begin with a status quo. This is how life is, but it's not good enough, right? Something is missing. Something is unwell or not right. So then the character goes on an adventure, and the adventure is about transformation. It's about character development, right? These are novel terms. These are narrative terms. But that's key to the stories we love. Well, it's key to our lives too. And so we're always, our life is not one story. Our life is there's constant stories. We're always stepping into different stories. We're at different stages based on the relationships we're in, right? I would encourage us not to think about our life as that kind of one, the beginning is when we're little, and then we have our formative years and now we're, towards the end. No, we're always in different stories. And so there's always the opportunity to look at the status quo, to flip it on its head and go on that adventure. Because, we're talking about peace, right? Have we nailed it? Have we gotten peace? Is it here? No, it's not here yet. So clearly the way things are is not yet what we want them to be or what God wants them to be. And so again, and what's my role to play in that? Right to this question you've posed, what might my life yet be? Because there has to be more for us as we engage the world and engage these important questions.
Yeah. We're running up on about a half hour now, but I have a couple more questions. And if anybody out there has a question, please feel free to ask. We have no commercial breaks coming up that we need to plan for or anything. We can go as long as we want.
Keep holding up books, though.
As I mentioned earlier, you're going to be in town here in St. Louis in July for our Bridges Ignatian Community Retreat. The theme of the retreat is attached to your book, From Warrior to Peacemaker, how Ignatius Loyola can guide us today. What might people expect out of the retreat, do you think?
A lot of what we're talking about. I think when I was preparing this book, a lot of people were like, well, Ignatius was a warrior, he was a soldier. How can we think about peace using his materials? So many of the exercises are grounded in very violent warlike imagery. And I think that that's true. And yet there is a lot to be said about the work of peace in here using this. And so I think what I would like us to do is in that retreat is to make that transition, to shift, to think about our own magus. Who has God made us to be? Where are we grasping, right? I think that idea of the warrior who kind of goes out and swinging with a sword, and making the turn then to the peacemaker, the one who is nonviolent. You can think about the scenes of the Triduum, right? The one who tries to stop Jesus's arrest by swinging the sword, met by Jesus, who says, we don't use the sword, and then he goes nonviolently to literally upend the status quo. That kind of trajectory is what we're going to be praying about. How do we do that in our own lives? How do we begin by grounding ourselves in our magus? How do we use some of these Ignatian meditations, particularly the two standards and the call of Christ? And then how do we end in a space that's creative? Because I think as I've been reflecting a lot on this theme of peace and Ignatian spirituality, creativity is a key element. Because creativity says, what we have in front of us, let's reshuffle it all. Let's imagine something completely new. Let's not be limited to what has been done before or the way things have always been done. Let's allow our imagination to run wild. And that's what we need if we're going to build peace, right, in our lives and in our world, because clearly we haven't gotten it yet, and we might need some new ideas. And that's foundational to the Ignatian story. That's how Ignatius, got up and was about his work in the world, right? After the cannonball moment, he had to spend time in bed imagining what his life could be.
Yeah, and I think related to that is this idea that, and I think we find this a little bit in the Call of the King meditation, that we are all being called to what at times can seem like impossible work, right? Like world peace. Well, how am I going to do that? Look at the rest of the world. And yet we're still called to it, right?
Yeah. In our own small ways. Again, some of us are called to be those great diplomats on the front lines of peace, and some of us are called to make sure our children are growing up in an environment that is affirming and flourishing, and not beating them down, not literally, of course, but it's like, oh, you're not good enough, or you'll never be anything, or just quiet down, right? There's plenty of opportunities in our daily lives to do the work of peace that Christ calls us to, sometimes we get lost thinking about those big grand gestures and miss the small, relational moments that are right in front of us.
Yeah. We do have a question that just came in from my friend Steve Tadrick. He says he loves how you use your imagination to express Ignatian spirituality. Jesus had us use our imaginations to experience life, as did Ignatius. Somewhere within our imagination lies the truth that we search for in our lives. Can you talk about the importance of the imagination, maybe imaginative prayer, in this whole process of peacemaking?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think the imagination is where God can most readily shape something new in our lives, right? And so our imagination is formed by, what do we want in life? Those great desires. Where have we been in life? Who are the people that are a part of our lives? And also the culture that we're kind of consuming. I love fantasy and fairy tale and science fiction. So a lot of my imaginative stories are fueled by those genres. So I think that we are able to project ourselves into some of these stories, and to think about how, again, I sit here in this office all day long. There's not a lot of what am I going to see? The same thing again and again. But when in my prayer, I put myself in a story or put myself in a parable. I think these parables that were mentioned are really good ones. Well, what is the pearl of great price? Is it literally, am I literally pulling a pearl out of an oyster or wherever a person finds pearls, or is that something else? I mean, you can imagine yourself in a field, and when I find it, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? And how do I make use of that? Again, I think that as we think about what that is uniquely in our own lives, if we understand it and then make use of it, right, that is interwoven in our unique calls for peace. Because again, I think the more we understand ourselves and our God has given us to do, the more we can be, people of peace in the world. I say one more thing, Steve, just because it's almost Star Wars Day. I always think about my invitation with kind of these movies and stories that we love is to pray with them. Don't just read about them, pray with them. And so something like Star Wars, right, where we have these great visuals like the dark side cave. What if we enter the dark side cave, right? What if you take these scenes and these motifs that are so cool and fun and exciting, but pray with them as you would Scripture, as Ignatius invites us to, and then see what happens, right? And I think that's another useful thing maybe to answer this question, is that the imagination allows us to do that. God, we love certain stories for certain reasons. I think that's God at work in us. And so let's use that to better understand God at work in us.
Yeah. You just gave me an idea for a guest on this show. I understand our Jesuit media friend, John Doherty, has a new book out about praying with film, right?
Oh yeah. No, I think he'd be a great guest. Yeah. He's got a lot of good thoughts on how to approach film as a prayer experience. When his book comes out, I would get him on the horn here.
That's great. One more question as we wrap up. I mentioned earlier you have actually a newer book.
I do.
And for those of us who are parents or grandparents, this is a great book. It's called The Seagull on the Chapel. Tell us just briefly what this is about.
Yeah. Makes a great first communion gift, confirmation, catechetical stuff. So this book was written, my friend and I, Shannon Evans, wrote. This is our second book. The first one actually is about Mary, our mother too. So it's a good month for that. But this book was written, if you remember, when Saint Leo, when Pope Leo was elected, and we're watching the chimney, and there's a family of seagulls, a baby seagull up there, and that kind of just enchanted the world. And so someone had said to us, well, what if you wrote a book about that? Like, what's the story? And so that's what we did. We wrote this book called The Seagull in the Chapel, Story of Value and Worth. It's out now from Paraclete Press. And it takes as its starting point a seagull, Maggie, who wants to be a dove because she thinks doves are perfect. Doves are like, the Holy Spirit, and so why can't she be more perfect? Which I think is probably something we all struggle with, and certainly a source of unpeace in our own lives. Why can't we be better? And so she has this little journey where she wishes she could be a seagull. People tell her she can't do it, and she ends up next to the chimney of the Sistine Chapel and has an encounter with our new Pope. And it's just a lovely story about themes of acceptance and worth, and also set against the backdrop of the conclave. And so it's a great opportunity to talk with kids about, well, what's actually happening in the backdrop here? What does it mean when a Pope is elected? When black smoke versus white smoke? And in the back of the book, there's a kind of a kid level appropriate description of what the conclave is. So we're excited about it. It's very fun. It's out now from Paraclete Press.
Thanks for that. Is Shannon an illustrator, or did you guys write it together and there's another illustrator?
We've written them together. These are two different illustrators. The illustrator for this one is Angela Edmonds, and for Our Mother 2 is Ryan McQuaid. So just great, beautiful illustrations. I can open the seagull book here if you want to look a little more closely.
Yeah, show us a spread or two. Beautiful.
There's seagull just like lamenting, can't be a dove, and then she's sad. People are laughing at her friends. Let me get to the Sistine Chapel here so you can really see there's the legend of the conclave, as she calls it, and let's see here, as you can see a quick image of the Pope, because we really wanted to get this out in time for Pope Leo's first anniversary of his papal election. So it's been a lot of fun to talk to folks about and to share.
Thank you. Well, everybody check those books out. Finding Peace Here and Now, How Ignatian Spirituality Leads Us to Healing and Wholeness, or the Seagull and the Chapel. And if you're interested in joining us for our Ignatian Community Retreat this summer, that information will be up and registration live within a few days here on the Bridges Foundation website. And I'll put that up so that you have it. Thank you again, Eric, very much. As we sign off here, hold off. I have one more question for you. But thanks to you for joining us today.
Awesome.
And
thank you, Steve. Good to be with you
all of you for listening in. All right. And we do not have a date for the next Bridges Conversations episode yet, but stay tuned and we'll let you know. All right, then. See you next time.